So stemming from the hard-hitting documentary Dying for Gold comes the Justice for Miners campaign, which is aimed at highlighting the importance of health, safety and medical attention in the mining industry. So for the past 130 years, mining communities in Southern Africa have made the greatest contribution to the South African economy, an extremely heavy price to pay. So some of the effects, of course, are suffered by miners include a variety of lung diseases, which in some cases have led to fatality. Campaign manager for Justice for Miners, Matthew Mensah, and the director for Dying for Gold, Meyburgh, join me in studio this evening. To you both, very good evening. Ladies first. Let's talk about this documentary. I mean, I think it's been a long time coming. A lot has been said about the mining industry, and I think the title of it, Dying for Gold, is exactly as it's put. What inspired this documentary, if we could start there?
Very early on, in the early 90s, I came across a statistic of between 800 and 900 people were dying every year in the gold mines. And to me, that was an astonishing statistic, that people weren't talking about it, there wasn't headline news, that it's just forgotten. And the reason why is because all of these people go back to the rural areas or to communities outside of South Africa, and the statistics are forgotten. And I'll never forget, at that point there was an interview with Bobby Godsell, and we asked him how do they know that it's dangerous underground? And he said, we see the coffin, they see the coffins coming home. And I was, how do you even deal with that? How can you make a statement like that? Anyhow, so that motivated me into the idea that I'd really like to make a film at some point about the deeper effects of the mining industry. And when the class action, the silicosis and TB class action came about, it was another prompt that something really needs to be done. And as we go further into the so-called sunrise industry, I think we have to take account of where we actually are and what we are really doing to people across the southern continent, migrant workers and their families, and in this case very much the families who have to support the miners when they come home ill, and in very rural areas full of poverty, it's the women and the families that have to support and look after ill miners, and they're literally, the burden has shifted into the rural areas.
And quite interesting that you mentioned that, because you speak about the silicosis class action, and it automatically brings me to something that's been in the news just of recent, the Lily Mine incident, where you've got families themselves who still have not got closure in a very similar incident, and some would argue that the mining industry simply doesn't care.
No, it doesn't care. I mean, just 2 months before Sharpeville, 437 miners died underground. They are still entombed there, just south of Vereeniging, in a mine. Nobody remembers them, and there they are. If you can, the imagination of that, 437 people are underground there, and the Lily Mine is just another consequence of mining and bad mining practices, unaccountability, government that's not making mining accountable, and the quid pro quo of employment. Unemployment drives the industry and has made it so easy for miners to be exploited within the industry.
Catherine, we'll talk about legislation very shortly. Matthew, let me bring you in there, but you're doing something about it. At the Mining in Durban earlier this year, you were there with a first of its kind campaign called Justice for Miners. Talk to us a bit about that and the reaction from mining bosses who were in attendance there.
Well, first and foremost, I mean, thank you for having us. And I mean, when I first was contacted by SABC, which is the South African Resource Watch, and also the campaign that she's doing in the documentary, Dying for Gold, was to create more awareness, and especially to ensure that all these miners that are suffering from tuberculosis and silicosis can actually find out where they can get the compensation. It's been made very, very difficult for them. And if you can imagine, if you're a miner that's now back in Lusiki, etc., and you're now being told, okay, you can submit your papers, but the only place you can do it is in Johannesburg. How are you even going to do that? I mean, how would you even expect some of them to have access to computers to even start sending an email, even having an email address? So we need to make sure that it makes it more easier for them to be able to get that compensation they are justified to, and which the court has been giving them the rights to. And to answer your question, we thought that we need to give some awareness, because doing that mining in Daba, we need to show that this is what it's about, end of it. You know, for all those things that they're talking about inside, this is the people that's taking the bunch of all the billions and billions of dollars that's coming out from those mines, you know, and we have to remember those people that's doing all the hard work and whose families are shattered by when the breadwinner dies, and especially, as Catherine said before, you are now left with a wife and children to kind of fend for themselves. It's again because they don't have any access to compensation.
But do the mining bosses get that? Did you get a sense that they got that during that activation at the mining in Daba, or is it just business as usual?
Well, I think that if I answer first, from where I see it, is that I feel that they feel that they have done their part by some of those mining companies that's put out the money towards the compensation. But it doesn't help when you made it so difficult for people to actually get access to that. And you can't say that there's anything done when to this day there's not even been £1 paid out to any miners at all.
In terms of legislation, Catherine, do you think that the South African government has done enough to protect, some of these miners? I mean, Matthew speaks about, miners who've gone back to Lusiki, and I mean, obviously, if you look at how it was much back then, where families or the fathers, the breadwinners, would leave the rural areas and come to Johannesburg and mine, there are many unanswered questions about, what remains of those families and the breadwinners.
Okay, first about the legislation, there are two aspects which are what we're dealing with. The one is accountability, and legislation is in place largely as far as health and safety is concerned. Yes, it can still be improved, but largely it is not policed by the government. The mines are self-regulatory, so you're putting the control of health and safety in the hands of the dragon, really. You're not actually taking accountable. You're not making them accountable. On the other side is the legislation that governs compensation. So as Matthew is saying, it is virtually, the bureaucracies involved in that legislation is very, very cumbersome. So it is difficult even for us who have tried on behalf of a miner in Mozambique to find out whether the compensation is available, is it coming through, what is happening. We failed, and we have every last we have conduits straight to TEBA, straight to the Chamber of Mines, Minerals Council. We have those connections, and yet we weren't able to help them. So you can imagine what it's like for people who don't even know, first of all, that they're owed compensation, that this disease actually came from the mines. It's not because they are cursed, it's not because of some other disease, it is because it came with them from the mines. And that belongs in the mines, and the mines need to take responsibility. And just answering the question around, do the mine bosses know? Yes, they've known for 130 years that this is what happens in gold mines in South Africa. Silicosis and TB are prominent. They have been in there. They've had endless commissions throughout the century about these problems, and yet they have not dealt with it. All they have done is improve their recruitment systems to replace ill workers. That's what they did.
We're quickly running out of time. Matthew, let me bring you in there. Obviously, you had this activation during the mining in Daba. I mean, it shouldn't just be a once-off, I'm sure you would agree. No. How do you plan then to use this campaign going forward? So
we're doing a full rollout now as we speak, and also we are part of the, first of all, we have the website justiceforminers.org.za, where we can ask people to come in and help sign the petition, but also to join at the Human Rights Festival taking place on the 20th to 22nd and at Constitution Hill. And as Catherine was saying before, it's like, no, we need to have that stronger dialogue. I mean, I was really impressed, for example, with when we did the activation, that of all the people that came out, Mrs. Bridget Harderby, she came out and talked to all the miners, and she really showed passion and wanted to help with that dialogue, and those are the things that really helps. And even now, those conversations are taking place now just because of her coming out and supporting.
All right, just very quickly, I know we run out of time. That petition, you will then hand it over to Parliament, if I'm not mistaken, is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. Unfortunately, we will run out of time. Matthew Mensah, who's the campaign manager for Justice for Miners, and Catherine Meyburgh, who's the director for Dying for Gold. Thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight.